Good morning and greetings from the Église Sainte-Thérèse in Hirson. If there was one thing that Franz Liszt was universally admired for, it might well have been his harmony. There is, of course, the famous quote by Wagner about his own harmonic development being in such great part due to Liszt. And there is also the fact that all the music which came after Liszt in terms of harmony stood so much in his debt. Now, this is a concept or a way of speaking which I think is sometimes misunderstood or not understood in the way that I think it ought to be. Liszt, of course, in his music was often quite experimental, and he used harmonies which do not exist in the book. What I think one should actually focus on, instead of these isolated incidents of strange collocations of notes, is also the way that he was able to use a succession of well-known chords, even simple chords, in such a refined and well-judged manner so as to make possible a transcendent beauty. I'd like to give an example from the prayer from Christus. I think this is the seventh number of the oratorio. This example comes from the very end of the Pater Noster. Let me give a little bit of context, starting from the line Libera nos ab malo. So what we see here is that the first thing that happens is, of course, the diminished chord is interpreted in two different ways. This is one of the processes with which Liszt was most associated, because, of course, the diminished chord can be inharmonically reinterpreted. What we have here is going from C major to F flat major via the intermediary of the diminished. So what happens here is that the E of the C major chord is then made into the root of a diminished chord. So we have E, G, B flat, D flat. If we take an inversion of this and reinterpret it inharmonically to become a root, then at the top we no longer have an E but an F flat, and this then resolves quite simply to an F flat major chord. The G goes to an A flat, the B flat goes to a C flat, the D flat goes down to the C flat. Now that we've gotten to F flat major, Liszt makes a very interesting cadence to proceed to return to A flat, which is the home key of this piece. So we start with the F flat major. We add onto the base of it D flat, which makes this into a seventh chord on the fourth scale degree of A flat. And from here, there's of course the typical 4-5-1 cadence. Now it's quite usual to interpolate a 6-4 chord in between the 4 and the 5. And this is particularly nice because two of the notes are shared. In this case, the A flat and the C flat. Now, Liszt does one more interpolation, which is also a suspension, because you see, for the 6-4 chord, we're basically holding onto the C flat and the A flat a little bit longer than the harmony dictates. So Liszt holds on to the C flat even a little bit longer than that, and that makes an augmented on top of the E flat. And notice that at the resolution he leaves out the third. That is actually a really elegant and daring solution to this particular situation. You see, what the music proceeds to do is to have a beautiful section in major. It's also what the text wants. And after we have been liberated from evil, and we proceed to the Amen, we want this kind of glowing color to return. And if we were to take this cadence, which is basically a minor cadence, and to put a Picardy third into it, we would be ruining the effect of the major part that we want to come after it. But if we had kept it in minor, then it would be too jarring and actually quite impossible to make the major have the effect we want. So by leaving out the third, we actually make it possible for the reintroduction of the major third to have the beautiful effect that we wanted to have, while seeming entirely natural. So just to play over this transition. So we notice that there is a subdominant coloring of this, and just by the fact that the G flat is introduced, which makes an absolutely usual and canonic dominant to the D flat major chord, the subdominant. We know that this piece is coming to an end. This kind of allusion to the subdominant being the traditional indicator of exactly that in many centuries of music. Now, this Amen phrase is made out of the following chords. Now we see the chromatic descent, which is important for a reason I'm about to mention. Now this phrase is then repeated again with a different, you could say, an invertible counterpoint. So at first it's the tenor, which has the melodic line. And then the soprano. Then it becomes the bass. And then the most amazing thing happens. Now, we've just had this chromatic progression, you could say, at least the progression bound together by a chromatic line. And now the opposite happens. Instead of the chromatic, we have the diatonic. And we have this progression which goes through the diatonic triads on all 7 scale degrees in a different order. first thing to notice is that the last two content chords of this are basically an allusion to the last chords of that chromatic Amen line which I had just played, meaning the fourth scale degree, the subdominant, and a kind of diminished chord that gets us back to the tonic. So in the Amen it was. Now if we find a diatonic version of this, and this is exactly what the chords that Liszt uses in the last two of this next phrase. So we now have the fourth scale degree and the seventh scale degree. Now here is the whole of the progression. So by scale degree 1, 6, 5, 3, 2, 4, 7, and back to 1. So you see that by sequentially exploring two contrasting areas of absolutely traditional harmony, there can be born this great effect of opening up. The narrative continues. So this phrase is repeated again, but with a slight change. And so on. So with this repetition, instead of looping back around to the tonic through the 4 and the 7, which is a sort of reflection of the last two chords of the chromatic Amen phrase, we continue on the 4. It's as if to say the first Amen phrase has this kind of a little bit of sadness in it, simply because of the flattening of the 6th degree, the F going to the F flat. And we had this great opening up with all these glowing full triads, and which ends in a similar way, and we close it back down. And we repeat it again, and it's as if the music wants to say, but this time we don't need to close it back down, we can continue opening it. And that's exactly what it does. As a matter of interest, there is something quite striking and beautiful going on in the coloristic aspect of this final A-flat major chord. It's to do with the way the chord is scored. So, well, first of all, let me mention that the chord has the particular effect that it does because of the plagal cadence leading to it, the so-called Amen cadence. And so about the scoring, we have the top sopranos on the A-flat, at the top, and the second voice at the E flat, a fourth below. Now, the really interesting thing that creates such a wonderful effect when this is sung by a chorus, of course cannot be done at the piano in any comparable way, is that the top soprano on the A flat falls down an octave to the lower A flat, while the mezzos stay on the E flat. So we have well, I'd like to conclude by remarking that to me this is a truly underappreciated aspect of Liszt's genius. Indeed, one of the first people to expressly underappreciate it was Camille Saint-Saëns, who wrote that Liszt, especially in his religious and choral works had a tendency to believe that certain successions of very simple chords had a meaning which nobody else could see. Well, what I can say is that when I hear the Pater Noster with these simple harmonies, that's a moment which means a lot to me.